You're listening to Three Makes Baby, a podcast about fertility, family, and genetics. I'm Jana Rupnow, a fertility counselor and author of Three Makes Baby. Welcome to the show. My guest today is Stacy Taubman here with me. Thanks for joining me, Stacy.
Absolutely. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
And you found out, I was reading a little bit about your story. You reached out to me on Instagram and told me more about what you've discovered, but it was really during the pandemic, the beginning of it. Yeah.
Well, close to the pandemic.
Okay.
So I found out right at November 2019, but, really starting to get to know my new biological family and start this relationship right before the pandemic hit. So the pandemic really played a big role in this transition or entry into this world, but I found out right before it.
Wow. So basically you were talking, I know I was reading a little bit of a blog that you put out. And so you were talking about sort of how everything changed for you in really a span of 6 months.
Yeah. Well, and the blog post you're referencing was something I wrote about, how I was feeling about COVID and how it was impacting my life, and this feeling of like everything has changed, and yet in some ways nothing has changed. And it really reminded me of some of the same feelings I had just navigated through in November of 2019. And so it was just interesting to be in a similar place, but yet for a really different reason. And just so that blog post was really just about the parallels of this like world disaster that we're all collectively experiencing. So something that everyone can understand. And yet this experience that for people who aren't going through it can sometimes be hard to understand.
Yes. And I will make another leap of comparison there in saying that one thing that people don't realize, I think, is they think the discovery of being donor conceived is just this moment in time, and then maybe life just goes back to normal somehow.
Well, wouldn't it be easier if it was? I mean, I understand why they think that. Yeah. It's great if that's how it was.
Yeah. But what I think people don't realize is that it is life-changing, and everything does change. Especially what's really come to my attention recently is the discovery of new siblings and how every so often people are finding new siblings, and that cycle starts all over again. So there's no end.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say the sibling thing. I brace for impact every time, I get a push alert from 23andMe or Ancestry.com. I just brace for it. I have not yet had a new sibling appear, so I can't speak to that experience, but I definitely can speak to the bracing for impact.
Yeah. And how did you find out? I know you mentioned in your blog that it was a 23andMe test that you got for Christmas, or you asked for a gift, I think.
For my, actually, yeah. So my 40th birthday was actually in 2018. And I asked my husband for 23andMe. My father, who raised me, had been sick for quite some time with a pretty rare heart disease, or heart issue, I should say. And so, and he was essentially actively dying, if you will. And so watching your father deteriorate and suffer for 4 years and know that it might be a genetic issue, and even ask your father to be genetically tested so you can see if you have it. I definitely was reaching that point, and turning 40 is a pivotal point in life, and so there was I thought that would be a great time to get that lovely 23andMe test. It really didn't register. It was just that's interesting, and I moved on, which is so interesting, because that's a weird reaction in some ways, and in others, not at all.
It basically, see the information and think, oh, that's strange, but it doesn't really sink in, or then there's a lot of confusion around it. Some people think it's a mistake, or, I know just the whole centimorgan, trying to understand what that means and how people are related to is really confusing. So again, you can look at those tests and sort of that can go over your head. So that makes sense that it didn't fully sink in. When did you come back to it then?
Yeah. Let me just back up before I answer that, because I think what's interesting about what you just said is I also think part of life is you have to be ready for something to land, right? And I wasn't yet ready for that information to land, nor did I have the space. And so when I came back to that was June of 2019. because my father had passed at the end of 2018. So I had had time to mourn. My business in Denver was stable and doing well. So I just had sort of stabilized in life, if you will, and had more space. And what was interesting is another cousin popped up, a second cousin, Robert Reisenberg. And he and I were like, how are we connected?
Mm-hmm.
And just some backstory about me. I was a high school math teacher. I have my degree in math. I'm a big nerd and I love math.
Mm-hmm.
And which I know there are definitely your listeners. Some of them are cringing and then, having flashbacks and PTSD from high school. But
From their high school math teacher. Is that what you're saying?
Right. I hear that more times than not. Robert is an actuariist as well. So he also has and that's a profession that people who get math degrees go into. And so he also has a love and a thirst of solving a puzzle. And so it was funny because he and I just sort of started on this path of like, it was just a math problem to solve and curiosity of weird, how are we related? Let's figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And so he roped in his relative, who's the family tree expert. And, we start going down this path. And any good mathematician, when you hit a brick wall, you gather more information.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried to do that by talking to my mother, by talking to my sister, talking to some of my other cousins. And it was a really interesting experience how they all reacted.
What'd they say?
Well, it's funny. I had lunch with my mother. I'm in Denver more times than St. Louis these days, but I came into St. Louis, it was appropriate and waited to have a conversation with her in person. And I sat down with her and I said, Mom, do you think your dad is your dad? Because that's what I thought. I thought, my mom was an accident. So maybe her dad wasn't her dad. Maybe there was an affair involved. And I definitely caught her off guard because imagine a 41-year-old secret that you have kept all this time. Imagine, if you will, if your husband felt very protective of this information and swore her to secrecy and he'd only passed 6 months prior. So her reaction was very startled and very shutting down the conversation. Like, nope, that's not it. And
that was it. She just sort of like, no, and then moved on.
Moving on. Yeah. And I even asked her like, well, is my dad my dad? And she was like, yes, of course, and just sort of shut it down. And I think she was in a state of shock. And I think she was feeling very conflicted because, she's a smart lady. And anyone who knows me knows that good luck with that being the end of that conversation.
Oh, no. Yeah. Okay.
So at that point, I'm all in and my gut knew something was off there, but, not exactly what. So I did ancestry.com.
Okay.
And a half sister and a grandmother showed up. And at that point, I had already narrowed down in the family tree, people of interest, if you will. And I even had sent a picture who turned out to be my biological father to her prior to the test and said, do you know Grant Stevens? Do you know this man?
And she didn't. Was it
she could honestly answer. She did not. That was honest. There was some honesty and then there was some dishonesty. So anywho, got ancestry.com back October 3rd, 2019. And, started, and my first thought, which I'm sure for a lot of people, because I think I was still in a state of shock, was affair. I just assumed it was an affair. I never knew my mother had fertility issues.
Okay. So she never even shared that much.
No, which was part of the pain, right? Because I had fertility issues and I had gone through IUI and failed, and my mother's always been a wonderful, supportive cheerleader. And, going through that, it would have been lovely for her to have felt comfortable and safe to have shared that. Yeah. So that was a point of pain.
Time.
Totally.
Yeah. Such a different time, but you would think even within a family, you could open up when you were going through that. But I think by that time it gets so deep, deeply buried that it just almost, they can't adjust.
Well, and secrets are tough.
And then grief wrapped in the secret, and those combined, they can get like super buried. And then when they're super buried, I think the
Ooh,
people
yeah.
themselves don't even realize that what they're doing in their
And then
lives.
add the layer to her husband, right? She is a loyal, caring human. And, he swore her to secrecy and really didn't want to know, because back in the 70s, as I'm sure you've discussed in
Hmm.
previous podcasts, they
Hmm.
mixed the sperm,
Hmm.
donor with dad. And they said, could be yours. And so
Yep.
with that
Yeah. They
illusion,
used denial as a force. I hope you can still hear me. They used denial as a very powerful tool to
yes.
keep secrets.
Yeah. And I think it was very important to my father and his mental health. My father was a fabulous father, but from a standpoint of like emotional intelligence and the journey we go on and self-discovery and self-improvement, he wasn't in a place where that was something he could have navigated well.
Hmm.
It would have been
Okay.
very challenging for him.
Hmm.
So I understand where my mom was coming from. There was some protecting of her husband in there.
Yeah, makes sense. And what feelings came up for you? I know you mentioned feeling hurt. Were you angry with her?
Oh, for sure. So what
Mhm.
was interesting is I got the test back on February 2nd and got home from work late and sort of started looking at it, but just barely scratched the surface. And then the next morning I got up quite early and drove home from Denver to St. Louis. So imagine, if you will, a 12-hour car ride
Mhm.
where, you're digging into, and for your listeners, and I think it's gotten better, but back in 2019 on ancestry.com, it would, the way it listed these people is it would say first cousin or closer.
Right. Hmm.
And so when you first see these people, my biological grandmother and my half sister, you don't understand it at first. And so you have to like dig in and click on it. And it gets you to these pages that then says, 99% chance this person's either your grandmother, it lists all the different things. So putting all the
Yeah.
pieces together was happening over this 12-hour car ride home.
Okay.
So I had texted my mother in the morning and just said, hey, what's going on? I don't think my father was my father. And she said, we need to talk when you get home from your car ride. And
Okay. Okay.
I did
Yeah.
not want to talk to her at that point. And by time I put all the pieces together and by time I realized that my biological father was Grant Stevens and, that he was a med student at WashU,
Hmm.
6 years younger than my mother, had just gotten married months before I would have been conceived.
Hmm.
I
Now,
was like, I don't want to talk to my mother at this point. I just said to my mom, I don't want to get on
okay.
the phone with you. I just want to know
Okay.
two things. Did dad know? And is it
Uh-huh.
true? And
Okay.
she would not respond to me. She was like, we need to get on the phone. And I was like, I have zero desire to speak to you at this point. And then this is a little bit
Okay.
crass and trigger
Yeah.
warning, but I said, unless you were raped, I have zero desire to talk to you right now. I will calm down and we can talk later. But right now,
Hmm.
we
Hmm.
I don't want to get on the phone with you. So I just want to know, is it true? And did dad know? And she kept hedging,
Oh.
and it's interesting. You
Yeah.
asked about my feelings on the car ride home. It was still a math problem. It was still
Hmm.
interesting to try to figure it out. And
Yeah.
my husband thought it was weird that I didn't want to get on the phone with her, but it was interesting as it was sort of starting to sink in and become more of a reality. And at
Yeah.
that point, then the emotions started to flood. And at that point, I was a mess.
Well, yeah, and I want to say that I think this is really important for anyone who's, I know I have people that are listening that are trying to figure out how to tell their adults children
Yes.
that they haven't told them yet. And I think there's so many feelings around this. So I want to
Yes.
say I am a child focused therapist. And when I say child, I also mean when you're an adult in the matter, you didn't have control over this. And so what happens with that when you
Yes.
discover this, there's a lack of control that can really, it turns your world upside down and it can make people feel as if they have lost control in life. And we want
Mm-hmm.
to, I want to help people to feel grounded again and feel centered. So
Yeah.
that is I want everyone that's listening to know that that's where I come from. And that's why. So I will say this in that moment, and when you are finding out, to those parents that are, maybe thinking of these moments coming up, your adult child, let them feel and say and do what they need to. And if you couldn't talk to her then, that is
Yes.
what you needed, and that is perfectly fine. And so I think that's so important. And your mom was trying to control it still.
Right. I was clear what I needed in that moment was I was not getting on the phone with her. But what was interesting is, when she kept pushing a little bit, I finally just said, well, clearly I have my answer and I'm done here, And when I said that, that's when she finally caved, and at that point it like all hit me and I like whoosh of emotion. And then, because if you're not willing to tell me, we know something's up here. But after I said that, that finally freed her up to finally just admit it. And she said, your father never wanted to know you were conceived through artificial insemination. And for me, it was like, holy cow, plot twist. Like, what? Like, that's not at all what I saw coming. And so it was very interesting to go from this anger of you had an affair with my father and, you never told me and, all those emotions to wait, what? Completely, plot twist, new information. I'm caught off guard. What's happening?
So your anger was about you were angry at her because you thought it was an affair.
That was a piece of it.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Got it.
That was a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. That makes sense. And then she was,
because I couldn't understand it. I was like, what are you doing? And look, people have relationships with people younger than them, but knowing my mother and knowing my father, I couldn't understand what she was, she was a teacher at the time. What are you doing with a med student 6 years younger than you who just got married? Yeah. He got married in August, you're conceiving me in October, and you have a husband yourself. Like, what are you doing? My mother's and I have a great relationship and I see her as a certain person. So I was angry because it was different from the script that I had of who my mother was.
Yeah. And imagine if you couldn't have gotten that. Well, eventually you would have probably, but like if your mother had passed and you couldn't talk to her about it, that happens a lot.
It's so sad because unanswered, like the lack of answer is just torture in some ways.
And not just being able to have that healing dialogue that you can, sometimes
absolutely.
It's healing, sometimes it's not, but at least to have the possibility of it is important. So, wow. So then, new information sinks in, and then were you willing to meet with her or to sit down with her then at that point?
It took me a little bit of time. Luckily my husband, who's lovely, he knows that my mom has been a good mother and all the things. And so, my husband actually facilitated we went out to dinner, with her, I want to say, 3 weeks later. And so, that was a step in the right direction and having some conversation and understanding, and her being willing to give me space to ask the questions. I was definitely quite numb still and quite angry. And, it's interesting you brought up the child piece. I really appreciate that you're there. And that you bring that up because, one of the emotions or feelings is I really mourned and felt sad for that child, who I was as a kid and how much this information would have made my life make so much more sense and helped navigate my childhood in a more positive way. Okay. I wouldn't change my parents. I'm very thankful for who raised me and how they raised me. But I mourn for that little girl and how different I would have felt with this piece of information. This is very important information that would have shaped how I felt about myself, how I viewed myself, and how I navigated the world.
Yeah.
So I mourned for her, and I felt really bad for her.
For sure. And were there things that you wish you would have? Were there things that made more sense once you found out?
Oh, night and day. Yeah. So we have to skip ahead to the story to help understand that. So I reached out to Grant, my biological father, almost immediately, actually on the car ride home. As I told you, I was on a 12-hour car ride home. And in the morning, I reached out to Grant.
Wow.
I'm pretty good on the internet. And I was so I was able to get his email. And I just said, hi, your relatives showed up as my relatives, blah, blah, blah. Do you know Susan Todman? Because keep in mind, at that point, I thought an affair.
Okay, yeah.
But I'm smart enough not to accuse a stranger of something like that. I just said, do you know who Susan Todman is? By the time I got home, 10, 11, 12 hours later, I reached out a second time and I was like, so I just want to apologize. I now know that you were an anonymous sperm donor in your 20s. I'm sure you never would have imagined, doing something like this 20 some odd years later, I would be able to have this information. I said, I just want to know my health history and if I have any siblings. I'm not looking for anything from you. He did not see those emails.
Okay. So,
And so I did not hear from him. And, Grant is a world-renowned famous plastic surgeon.
okay. And yeah, I noticed you're freely using his name. So is he okay with that
Yeah, he's
too?
very comfortable with. I'm actually in the process of writing a book
Okay.
about all of
Yeah.
this. Yeah, so he's very comfortable, and
Okay.
he's a very public, prominent, man in the world, and very comfortable with his and all of this.
Good.
And yeah, he's excited about the book coming out
Mhm.
in December. But so yeah, he didn't see any of that, and my husband's like, Stacy, he's famous. Like, this man's not going to contact you. Like, just, you have a great life, make peace with it.
Mhm.
And so I sort of started that process. That's that whole everything has changed and nothing has changed, and the nothing has changed. So I do have a great life,
Mhm.
I love what I do. I have a great business, all of those things, and sort of trying to live in that place.
Mhm.
And yet at the same time, everything has changed and you're living in that place. But
Mhm.
anywho, I had
Mhm.
gotten to a decent place, had went to my counselor, all the things,
Mhm.
started the healing process, and woke up on November 6th, 2019 to like 50 likes on my Instagram page.
Mhm.
And what I haven't mentioned is I did try also this is embarrassing, but I slid into his DMs on Instagram
Yeah.
because he's a very active on Instagram. And I just
Mhm.
said, hey, look, I don't know if you saw my emails. This is my last, hooray or whatever.
Mhm.
And just said basically the same things. And he did not see that message until November 2019. So I woke up to the message from him. And one of the first things he said, which was life-changing for me, is said, I've always been a hardworking risk taker and an entrepreneur. And you cannot encapsulate who I am better in that sentence.
Yeah. I can relate to that. Yeah.
Totally, right?
Yeah.
And because I was raised by a very risk adverse family,
Mhm.
didn't understand,
Mhm.
so it's been a really interesting journey
Mhm.
to get to know him and his family better, and to see myself as a personality and a brain wiring
Yeah.
mirrored back to me.
Yeah.
Like, my mother physically looks like me, so I've had that physicality mirrored back to me.
Mhm.
Although, my ear, this is such a silly thing in some ways, but and yet not, my ears have always stuck out, and so it was a point of insecurity, and, made fun of as a child, called Dumbo, all the things. And no one in my family had those. And when Grant started sending me pictures, what I learned is that's a Stevens trait. It's just very
Oh,
common in the Stevens family to have these ears. And so
wow.
it became a source of pride versus pain.
Good.
And
Yeah.
imagine if my child,
Mhm.
the younger self had that
Right.
source of
Right.
pride. What a
Exactly.
different experience.
It's a feeling of belonging, of
It
belonging.
is.
And in fact, there's been research that shows that body image is an important factor in genetic mirroring. That
Mhm.
the lack of a body image mirroring in your family can really create some insecurities
Yeah.
um,
And trauma. But I would push back. I think
mhm.
more importantly, for me at least, is the way my brain is wired, and the way I think, and the way I look at the world, and my own hopes and
Yeah.
aspirations, and that wiring to me was more impactful and lacking in my life. And meeting him and having someone who thinks and functions and wired like you, like, it's just completely changed. And you know
Mhm.
rather than feeling like a second rate version of the people who are around you and wired very differently than you, feeling like a first rate version of
Mhm.
myself. And oh, look, there's other people in the world who look at life and function the way you do. I mean, that's life changing.
It's self-acceptance. It's self-acceptance in the most
Totally.
powerful way. Yeah, and I think and maybe the studies on the body image, it's because it's a little easier to narrow down because it's
Totally.
so
It's
hard
tangible.
to say. Yeah, it's so hard to explain the wiring. I have people that if I, really push back on me about and tell me that my message about genetics is biodeterminist and it's and that let's keep the science out of it somehow. And
Look, I get it though. Like, I was a high school math teacher. I really believe, in the nature nurture argument. I would really lived on the side of, it's the people you surround yourself with, it's your community. And I think where we go wrong is we oversimplify. Like, you cannot take that away. I am who I am today because of my wonderful parents who raised me, because of the people I grew up with, all the things and the choices I made. I built a company around, creating community and being around inspiring women for a reason, right? Because I needed that sense of family and belonging and I didn't have it. So I created it, right? Just like I think a lot of people aren't raised in families that work for them due to their choices, due to who they are in life. So they create the family, it's the family you create. And I think there's a lot of power behind that. But I think where we go wrong in life is this concept of or versus and. You are correct. And that is powerful. And, now I see it's a 41-year-old, it's a science experiment. Twin studies in science is very impactful. And in many ways, I feel like I'm in a twin study. Look, I haven't met these people for 41 years and now I meet them, and it is spooky how similar our brains think. And even like choices on a menu, even something as silly and trivial as like, it's just a fun little story. As I was with them the second visit, and I am in the backseat with Grandma Donna, my biological grandmother, and I put a mint in my mouth and I sneeze, and she looks at me and she's like, "Oh my God, do you sneeze every time you eat a mint?" And I'm like, "Yes, I do." And she's like, "Oh my God, so do I do." So then she runs to her son, Grant, my biological father, and is like, "Hey, listen to what just happened." He's like, "Funny, we've never talked about that." I do too, which is like such a silly,
but it's a
trivial,
sense of
non-important thing.
Yeah.
But it's just this like, oh my God, you too. Before the phrase "you too" became meaning something else, I have always said there's incredible power in Me Too moments. And I really believe that that whole "you too, me too," that's a really important experience in life. And to your point earlier, it really leaves you feeling grounded and at peace when you can have yourself mirrored back to you and have that "me too" or "you too" moment.
Yeah, we want to celebrate that for our kids. And so, it's, you were saying the either instead of but, it's and that's what I mentioned, dialectical thinking, which I said this many times. My editor wanted me to take it out of the book. And I was like, no, that's the point.
Yes.
I have to leave that in. It's not either or, it's both.
But that's a hard concept for people. If we,
It's very hard. It's very hard. It's the fifth stage of what they call the fifth stage of thinking, the most advanced stage. And it's hard to get there. And I'm not saying that, that you have to be right there in the middle of it.
No,
you
it
can be
takes
working
time.
towards that. But I think I agree. And I think what's important is that I, like you, was on the side of, it's who you surround yourself with. It's your environment. I was the same way until I had the same experience where I met biological family, and my twin brother had spooky same mannerisms as my biological father.
Yep.
And just all those little, the mint and the sneeze, things like that. When you go, whoa, this is powerful. So I think it's important to listen to people who have actually experienced these things and can say, hey, I'm not saying that it's either or. I'm saying it's both. And I'm so happy I am because of both. And so I hear you saying that too.
And it was really interesting because I was very angry at my mother for a long time. And then Grant's best friend actually is in St. Louis, and one of his many friends is in St. Louis. And his friend actually got on a call with me and he said, "Hey, my daughter is donor conceived and she doesn't know."
Okay.
And she was donor conceived from a sperm donor. And it was so helpful for me to hear his genuine fears and issues and why he was struggling to decide what to do next. And it really helped open my eyes to what that experience would be to be on the other end of that spectrum. I get it. It's terrifying to feel like your child might reject you. Or that you might be positioned as a lesser parent. Like that's an awful, awful experience or, to worry about. But I love when I hear donor conceived people talk about it as, another relative, like a cousin or an in-law or a grandparent. Like that's really digestible. We can really wrap our head around how someone like that is in your child's life in this ancillary role, impactful, but ancillary. And that's the thing I would have wished for growing up, that Grant was in my life and Grandma Donna in this ancillary role. I wouldn't trade anything for my parents, but having them in my life would have been life-changing.
Yeah. And are they in your life still
They
currently?
are very much so.
Okay.
Grandma Donna and I speak quite a bit. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
even more like her than Grant, so she's the 89-year-old woman,
Mm-hmm.
so it's so neat to get to know her because my last grandparent actually passed in fifth grade. So I really missed
Okay.
out in some ways on having that
Mm-hmm.
grandparent experience. So how cool
Yeah.
that I get to have it in my 40s. Like
Yeah.
I'm
That's
so
great.
unbelievably thankful to have Grandma Donna in my life and just how
Nice.
accepting she has been and just welcomed me into her life. And it's been a blessing
Mhm.
for her. She can't wait for my book to come out. She even has a chapter in it.
Nice.
And then
Yeah.
Grant, like I said, has always been an entrepreneur and a hardworking risk taker. He actually inspired me to open up a new business, Spritz Med Spa. I've entered into the world of
Mhm.
aesthetics because of him. And so it's been
Yeah.
so fun. I am an entrepreneur at heart and starting a brand
And
new business in
sharing.
a brand new field that
Mhm.
I know nothing about. It's been just such a unexpected joy and fun
Yeah, sharing
experience.
sharing a similar profession, and so in a way, because you have that in common
Yeah,
with
so it's been a fun bonding
yeah,
experience. Yeah, so it's been
yeah.
great. Obviously COVID threw a big wrench in it, and is a very important piece of my story because imagine having this life-changing experience, going meeting these people, having very little, I didn't mention that, but I ended up meeting them in November of 2019, going in with very little expectations, but then having this like all-encompassing and like whoosh of an experience with these incredible people and and then having to sort of redefine how they fit in your life and being really excited to have these people in your life. And then, the world sort of implodes. And then it's like, question mark, what does this look like now? So it's been
Mm.
an interesting journey, but I'm thankful that we're past that and that we're on the other side and they are actively in my life again. And I get to see them on a pretty regular basis.
Oh, good, and you're lucky, not
I'm
all do
very
receive
lucky.
yeah, that reconnect, get that opportunity, so that's fantastic, it's good to hear. And then what would you suggest, what would you advice would you give to parents that are listening out there that have adult children that they haven't told yet? Do you have any
Uh,
advice?
Rip that band-aid off.
Just go for it. Yeah.
And that obviously I recognized that is such an easier said than done. And I do
Yeah.
really feel for the parents in that situation because nobody
Mhm.
wants to hurt their child and nobody wants to let their child down, and all the things that will come most likely from that experience. So gosh, I feel for them. But I really hope they find the courage to face that fear. One of my favorite books is Feel the Fear and Do It Anyways.
Yeah, for
Because it's
sure.
such a good book. And
Mhm.
gosh, your children will be so thankful. And well, I shouldn't say that. I can't promise that.
Yeah,
Let me back
we
that one
don't know
up.
how they'll
Yeah,
respond,
let me
but
back
I
let me take that back. But
yeah. Yeah, sure,
let me use
sure.
I statements. I am
Yeah.
so very thankful for the experience I have had, and it has been life changing. And I'm so grateful that um, that the opportunities that I have had have been those doors have been open. And I recognize that that's not what everyone will feel, and I recognize that's not what will happen for every child.
Mhm.
So, but yet you don't know until you give them the opportunity. And I think taking that off the
Yeah.
table is so unfair to people.
Yeah, so rip the Band-Aid off and then also get individual I would say get your own support, whether that's
Yes.
counseling or other parents that are
Yes.
going through it, finding a support group online. But
Absolutely.
because what happens when I see happening is the parents are still dealing with those, remember we talked about the super buried feelings.
Yep.
So they're still dealing with those super buried feelings. And then they're trying to almost explain that to to the adult child who does not need to hear all of that. That
Right.
is not for you you don't have to hold that for your parents. So
Yeah. Your
parents that are
parents.
listening, like,
Yes.
get your own support first so
And that
you
your
can just
feelings
be
are valid,
open.
right? Your
Mhm.
feelings are valid and it is a really hard thing for you as well, but that's not for your child to take on. So I
That's right.
love that
Yeah.
you are saying that because you can't give your child what they need if you're not coming from a place of, wholeness, if you will.
Yeah, and especially if you're still carrying the same reasoning that kept the secret in the dark for so long, if you're still
Absolutely.
holding on to that same reasoning, it's just not gonna go over well. So,
No,
yeah, definitely wanna help come to terms with the feelings that are coming up for you, whether that's guilt or, a different idea of yourself. So, yeah. Well, I know
absolutely.
you've gotta get run off to your next thing, but it
I
was so great to
do.
have you on, and,
Thank
if
you.
there's yeah, absolutely. So it was, do you wanna leave anybody with any information or how they
Um,
can reach out to
yeah,
you
that's
or
great. Yeah, I love talking about this. I'm very passionate about it. Like I said, I'm writing a book about my experience. It's not going to be out till December. But I'm
Yeah.
always open to chatting about this and being there in any way I can to support people who are on this journey, because it's not an easy one. And both from the kid and the parent, look, I get both sides of that
Mhm.
coin. I'm very active on social media, whether it's
Okay.
Instagram, Stacy Tabman, or LinkedIn for the professional world, if you will.
Mhm.
Yeah, so feel free to track me down on Instagram or LinkedIn, and always open to conversations.
If you are planning to tell your adult child they are donor conceived, you can go to my social media platforms at Jana Rupnow LPC and get some tips on how to prepare before you tell. So it does matter how you tell. There are ways to do it that are going to be more helpful. And I'm encouraging people to tell, if they haven't already, this International Donor Conception Awareness Day, April 27th, 2022. Tell your child if they're an adult, if they're a child, you haven't done it yet. Here's your opportunity. Here's your reason to begin speaking about it. And if you're donor conceived, tell your story, share your story, so others can learn from your experience and help generations to come. If you'd like some more help, I have some online courses you can take that will help you prepare to talk about donor conception on my website, janarupnow.com, and on my bio links on Instagram. Thanks for listening and have a great day.